Hello, everyone. It's been a while since we've had a podcast episode, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of the world right now and some of the things that have been going on. And at the end, I will give some updates about the project that I'm working on. But for now, I just want to go through a few brief thoughts. I want to start by taking a quick look at three case studies for the success of questionably democratic movements in the European context, these being in Italy, in Poland, and in Hungary. Now, the current Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, and the current government were formed by the party Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, which was a far right party that took power in a recent election, much in the same way as National Rally in France has hoped to do recently, although the Italian system is much more prime minister than president focused compared to the French one. But I digress. So in this case, the far right party, as it took power, Brothers of Italy, moderated itself, and Meloni has been a much more moderate center right, kind of conservative prime minister than expected. Conservative, not quite as radically far right, as radically populist as the previous politics of the party prior to election would have predicted. The party has moderated as a result of being in power. The case was different in Poland. The Law and Justice Party, led I believe by Jarosław Kaczynski, took power and spent many years, I believe almost a decade in power, and then was booted out by electoral politics. It was voted out in an election last year, I believe in last October. And it did not moderate during its time in power. It enacted far-right policies within the European context. It was diverging mainly only from parties like Viktor Orban's Fidesz in its strong support for Ukraine, which is more about Poland's domestic political context than the party's place on the political spectrum or its interactions with politics. So the party did not moderate. It remained far right, conservative, populist far right, not particularly radical, but far right. I digress. But it was still it did great damage to democratic institutions and democratic norms and undermined things quite substantially, but not enough to turn Poland into a non-democratic state, and indeed it was removed from power by a democratic election and left power relatively willingly. And the third case study, Hungary under Viktor Orban. Hungary is no longer a democracy. Some people will disagree with that, and the exact line is a bit messy, but I think it's safe to say that Hungary is no longer a democracy. Generally, the term used for it is an informational autocracy or an electoral autocracy. So essentially, a state that maintains the visible trappings of democracy, has elections, people vote, the votes decide what happened, but the actual underlying foundations are not there. They are removed. Free media is removed. Media is controlled by the government or by government-friendly parties. Opposition candidates are limited in their ability to engage in running or blocked from running altogether. Other examples of this include Turkey under Orban, not under Orban, Turkey under Erdogan, and the early stages of Putin's rule. He's shifted somewhat out of this category progressively over the last decade. But Hungary is no longer kind of a democracy. It maintains elections, but the elections are not free and not fair. They are heavily slanted in favor of the establishment. Media is owned by the government. People are prevented from running. So these are the three studies that we have, and so far there have been no successful attempts or pointing to reasons to believe that there will be soon successful attempts in removing Orban's party democratically, or to believe that that is feasible right now. So democracy in Hungary did not survive. Democracy in Poland did survive, but was seriously damaged. And democracy in Italy was relatively unharmed by comparison. Now, I want to minimize commentary on the particularities of the Italian situation because I'm not super familiar with Italian politics. So what I want to say instead is that essentially the main difference that I'm familiar with in the context of Poland compared to Hungary in the actual parties involved is that Hungary is Fidesz is a lot more personalist than Law and Justice. Orban makes up a much bigger part of the party than Jarosław Kaczynski. More important, as far as I can tell, are structural differences in how the government and democracy within these states is made up, which we aren't going to be getting into here because it is beyond the scope of this conversation. But we can probably guess that France, in the event of National Rally taking power, would be somewhere between Italy and Poland on the scale. And I would place the Trump presidency somewhere between Poland and Italy, leaning quite far towards Poland. And France, as I said, would probably be a lot closer to Italy than to Poland because it is a lot more effectively set up institutionally to resist subversion of democracy than Poland was. And certainly a lot more than Hungary. I'd also like to speak a little bit in broad terms about the assassination attempt against Donald Trump that occurred recently. I think everybody's probably familiar with the details of that. I think it's very important to put aside our feelings against Donald Trump as a politician in discussing this right now. Those who know me personally will know that I quite despise him and strongly oppose him both politically and dislike him as a person. But this sort of political action, political violence, is incredibly toxic to a democracy on an absurd scale. The degree of it is extreme, and the more it happens, generally, the more normal and the more acceptable it becomes as a means of engaging in politics. And that brings us closer to a Schmittian interpretation of politics, the friend-enemy distinction. To quote Ivan Ilyin, one of Schmitt's contemporaries, politics as the art of identifying and neutralizing the enemy. And that interpretation of politics is fundamentally just incredibly corrosive to the foundations of a democracy. And generally, I know there are some people who are not entirely opposed, even on the kind of more liberal side of the left and center, are not entirely opposed to the concept of Donald Trump getting shot in the head and dying. And I do understand that sentiment, but I think it is almost entirely emotional and largely poorly thought out. Very few of the goals that people who say or think this hold would be effectively accomplished through the degrading of democracy, and arguably could only, in the current American context, be accomplished effectively through democratic means in politics. And political violence directed against anti-democratic politicians tends to be more corrosive to democracy than the actions of those politicians, especially as it becomes more normalized. And it's my observation that there is a large tendency towards that already on the center and on the left, to put aside the right for now. A strong tendency towards understanding politics as the art of identifying and neutralizing the enemy, although they would not put it that way, perhaps. If not in general, if not in the broad sense, then within the specific context of American politics as it exists right now and within the context of Trump. And this idea is often taken up with the intent of defending democracy as a reaction to politicians and movements that are seen, often rightfully, as corrosive and democratically destructive. But this mentality, this view of political engagement is also incredibly democratically destructive and unproductive. And it does not make sense to have a democracy if you view around half the voting base of your country as your enemies rather than your opponents. And while we're on the subject of friend-enemy politics and Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi jurist for much of his career, or at least some of his career, perhaps not much of his career. I forget the exact dates off the top of my head. There is a common tendency, and has been since kind of the early Trump era, to compare America to Weimar Germany. And it is my opinion that that comparison is completely baseless. It can perhaps hold some use to compare individual figures to identify similarities, but in general, it is both unproductive, inaccurate, and also somewhat in poor taste. I think it is common right now, at least in the public discourse, to deeply underestimate the radical and extreme nature of politics in Weimar from the in the late 20s and early 30s. Um, People think about America right now as polarized and as a case of extreme politics, and maybe that's fair. Maybe that's fair, but not by comparison to Germany in the late 20s and early 30s, or really to Europe during that time period. The degree of political polarization, of extremes, of political violence in that time period is incomparable to modernity in America. Incomparable. And really, the this friend enemy distinction that I've talked about earlier, I'll try not to go back to that too much, was very, very prevalent in the way of viewing politics. And in fact, that was when Schmidt wrote his book on that, The Concept of the Political, I believe, in 1928. Was very prevalent in Europe at that time and in Germany in particular. And one of the things that is often left out of the story, aside from the fact that we talk about violence between the NSDAP and the KPD, between the Nazis and the communists. And yes, it is discussed, but the extreme nature of it and the frequency of it is often not given sufficient attention. I think calling it a low-grade civil war might be going just a step too far, but it gives you kind of an idea of where things were at in that time period in that place. And the second thing that is often ignored is that Germany wasn't really a democracy by the time that Hitler took over. Over the course of the three previous chancellorships, not so much Kurt von Schleicher, but Franz von Papen, and I forget who came before him. It'll come back to me. But particularly Franz von Papen, most of all. Democracy in Weimar was eroded to such a degree that whether you could call Germany at that point a democracy is extremely doubtful, and I would lean towards no. In, I believe, 1932, Papen actually, with the support of the president, Paul von Hindenburg, forced out the democratically elected government of Prussia, illegally forced it out through essentially means that outside of the state of I don't think the state of emergency was in place yet, but outside of rule by presidential decree, could not be accomplished legally and had no meaningful basis in law or norms, on the basis of not wanting the Social Democrats to control Germany's most important and populous state. To vastly, vastly oversimplify, essentially what happened was that the conservative military aristocracy, two separate things, military aristocracy, I can't communicate dash between them while speaking, but the conservative aristocratic and military elements within the government and within the political body subverted and overturned the democratic system, which was already very much on its last legs and essentially falling apart at that point. And then, in fear of losing control of it and of what would happen to them if they lost control of it, they then handed over what they had taken to Hitler. And he actually, in some ways, briefly, you could argue that he briefly returned the country to democratic functioning because that was a more efficient route to destroy the parts of democracy that remained. The laws that were used to ban the other political parties were passed democratically, at least on paper. The arrest of all of the communist deputies and the barring of some communist social democrat deputies before the vote is not exactly in the spirit of democracy. But it did represent a very brief return to parliamentary politics after years of rule by presidential decree, in the absence of functioning government and parties that were essentially willing to compromise. And finally, the thing that I started this discussion, this podcast episode, to talk about, the French election recently. It was a mess. A lot of people on the left and on the center have reacted to it positively as a case of the left and the center coming together to defeat the far right and to defeat anti-democratic populists. And I mean, that's, in my opinion, a grave misinterpretation, and a dangerous one, too. What happened in France, I will summarize it as best I can. There was a European parliamentary election. The far right party National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, did very well. And then the president, Macron, decided to call a parliamentary election. The interpretations of his motivation for this are quite wide ranging, and I don't feel quite competent enough on the discussion of French politics to comment on it in this capacity. But the two prominent theories that I've seen posed are that it was essentially a way of calling the French population's bluff in believing that they voted for National Rally purely as a protest vote, or alternatively, that he believed that some period of National Rally governance, without them being able to take the presidency, would undermine them as a party and some of their appeal as kind of anti-establishment outsiders, and would undermine them when the presidential and parliamentary elections were held in 2027. Now, if the latter theory was true, well, we'll get to that in one moment. What happened was that in the first round of the election, National Rally did quite well, and so the center bloc, Macron's coalition, and the New Popular Front, the left-wing coalition, which runs from moderate to very far left, agreed essentially to withdraw candidates from races where the other was ahead, so that they would have a better chance in each riding, prefecture, county. I'm not sure what the administrative division is in this case. But so their candidate in each region would have a better chance of beating the far right candidate. And as a result, National Rally, despite getting the most vote, was the third party by size in the new parliament. The New Popular Front came in first in terms of seats, and Macron's coalition came in second. And a lot of people celebrated this as a victory of the center and the left over the far right, and a grave defeat for National Rally. Understandable, and I personally do not like National Rally or want them to be in government, which is why I consider this such a misfortune. This will be interpreted by many people who were either supportive of or somewhat agreeable to the messaging of National Rally as essentially a vindication of their support for the party, and kind of proving the ideas that led them to support it to begin with. At least in some cases, not necessarily in all cases. But the idea that the left and the center, or in the view of people on the right, the establishment, has colluded to deny them their voice, to disenfranchise them, essentially. And has essentially, the system is working to keep the will of the people out of power. The party that the French people want to hold the most seats in parliament. This is not an illegitimate democratic process. This is not like against the spirit of democracy, and it's not by any means illegal or problematic within its own right. But within the context of modern kind of Western politics, it will be interpreted by many people in a way that will be democratically corrosive and will help National Rally in future elections. It will create feelings of alienation, disconnection, and disenfranchisement from democratic institutions and from the current and future center and left French governments and Macron. And this means that in the future, it is more likely than it was before that we will have a French election which hands both the presidency to Marine Le Pen and the parliament to National Rally. And if Macron's idea was originally to give National Rally a chance to govern without the presidency so that they would undermine themselves and be unable to win it, that was not a policy that I thought was unwise. And if that was his policy, then he has done the opposite in an incredibly unhealthy and destructive way. So I think the current French election was disastrous for the center and the left, and celebrating it is a crucial mistake. And I'm getting to the end of what I want to say, so the last thing that I want to discuss before we wrap up is I want to recommend some books. Not books that I entirely agree with. In fact, I'll probably mention a few of them. In some cases, I strongly disagree with parts of them, but that I think have some value for understanding, particularly what's happening in the United States right now politically. I'm going to start with The Once and Future Liberal by Mark Lilla, or Lilla? I'm not sure. Lilla. It's a very interesting piece of political analysis about liberalism in the United States. I didn't agree with all of it, but I thought that it was very insightful in parts, and I think a lot of people will find value in it for analyzing the current political moment. And I would highly recommend reading it with a critical eye. The same with regards to Surviving Autocracy by Masha Gessen, a Russian analyst, but in my opinion, more accurate and more valuable, actually, analyzing the American political context than the Russian one. Has two other books about Russia. No, more than that, but two other books about Putin. One called The Future is History: How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia, and the other one is Man Without a Face. It's a biography of Putin. I'm a bit iffy on it, but it's got a lot of value in it. Anyway, Surviving Autocracy is about the early Trump years. It ends, I think, around the time of the 2020 election. And it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it. Again, don't agree with all of it, but I'd recommend it. And I think a lot of people might find value in it for understanding the current political context. The next one that I'm going to suggest is Peril by Bob Woodward and Robert Acosta. And this book is essentially about the 2020 election. It's part 3 of a trilogy about the Trump presidency by Woodward. I have not read the other two, but based on this, I would probably recommend them. This one is very interesting and very good. And I think a lot of people would find value in it. Again, I'm saying that too often, so I'm going to try to stop saying that now. And the second last one on my list is The Road to Unfreedom by Timothy Snyder. Excellent historian, excellent intellectual, excellent activist. I do not agree with a lot of what he says about Russia in this book. I very strongly disagree with it, in fact, particularly with regards to the aforementioned Ivan Levin. But I think there's a lot of interesting discussion in this book, a lot of insights, and in general, I would highly recommend it. I thought it was very interesting. And the last book on the list is Tainted Democracy, I believe, by Zsuzsanna Szelny, which is about the rise of and role in Hungarian politics of Viktor Orban, who is one of the closer kind of modern political figures to Trump that we can use to kind of examine him and his politics and how he functions in power. Aside from Orban, I'm not sure if there is one. I'm suspicious, unfortunately, that there isn't. But if you can find a book in English examining in some detail the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, I think a discussion and a history of Yanukovych's time in office, his election, his prior failed election, and everything that happened with him, including the revolution to some extent maybe, but not primarily that, so something not focused on that, would be very valuable for understanding the European and particularly the American context. But as I said before, I'm not entirely confident that something like that exists in English, and I'm not going to recommend you a list of like 7 books that will give you collectively a pretty good picture of his presidency, because it might be insightful. And there is one other book that I do want to mention peripherally, and that is Weak Strong Man by Timothy Fry, which is a sociological analysis of Russia from, I believe, 6 years ago. It was before the invasion of Ukraine. It's quite outdated now. It was very relevant and very accurate when it was published, and it has a lot of valuable discussion about informational autocracy, the structuring of autocracy, and how personalist autocracies work and function, focused on Russia, but it has a lot of broad insight. There's another book that I'm going to tentatively recommend, not having read yet, and that is Spin Dictators by Sergei Glaziev, and a second author whose name I am unfortunately blanking on right now. The two authors wrote a previous paper which I have read and which was very interesting and valuable, in which they coined the term I used earlier, informational autocracy. And if you just want to seek out the paper, that might be just as good. I haven't read the book. I've heard good things about it, and I assume it's primarily fleshing out the concept discussed in the paper. On those grounds, I would strongly recommend it as well. And the last thing that I want to talk about today is I haven't been very active on this podcast recently. I haven't been doing much discussion as much as I would like. And so I want to update you all on what's going on right now. And essentially, I'm working on a new project. It is taking a long time and a lot of work, but I'm confident that it will be worth it when it is finished. It is a separate podcast attempting to give a broad historical overview of the Holocaust and a corrective to some of the common misconceptions which we now have a very good idea of in kind of academia and in the study of the Holocaust, but which haven't quite filtered through to the public consciousness yet. I am currently on the 3rd episode of somewhere between 10 and 14, and I'm hoping to have it out within the next 6 months. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I will try to update this more regularly, but I cannot make any promises. And one more thing that I wish to note, this has been, at least on my end, a discussion on the more casual side, and I haven't done any preparation for this aside from a couple of brief notes about what I wanted to talk about. So please don't take anything here as gospel. And with that, I want to thank you for listening, and have a good day.